Hello and welcome. This is a artist models, a conversation between Diana Seaver Greenwald and Susan Waller. And I invite you, Diana and Susan, to turn on your cameras as well. Um, Sorry for getting started just a few minutes late, but we are so thrilled to have you joining us tonight and so fortunate to have Diana and Susan with us. My name is Allison Deutsch, and I'm hosting this event on behalf of the Impressionist Futures Group, which is an international research group that we formed last spring with the goal of rethinking Impressionism collaboratively and expansively, raising new questions and advancing innovative approaches. So I'm joined today, along with our panelists, by the other members of the group, Alexis Clark, Claire Moran, and Samuel Raybone. And Alexis has popped in the chat the link to our website, which is www.impressionistfutures.com. We have a really exciting calendar of events that we are always adding to, and which you can see on the website, and where you can also sign up for our newsletter if you wish to be passively updated about our activities. So we encourage you to sign up for that. I just want to flag two future events as well. On the 28th of January, we are delighted that Harmon Siegel will be discussing his new book, Painting with Monet, with Carmen Rosenberg Miller. That will also take place online at 12 noon Eastern, 5 p.m. GMT. And Alexis and Claire will be going to CAA on February 14th. So they are going to be on a panel called Collaboration as Art Historical Practice with a paper entitled De-Hierarchizing Impressionism Studies Through US-UK Collaborations. So they would love to see you there. That will take place again, 14th of February from 2:30 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time in person. After that panel, Alexis and Claire will be welcoming anyone interested in engaging with the Impressionist Futures Group to meet for drinks. And again, details of this can be found on our website, and they very much hope to see you there. So today, we are delighted to facilitate this conversation about the relationship between artists and their models, and the way those relationships were perceived, the challenges in reconstructing both from archival records, and the possibilities of bringing them to exhibition. I'm joined by two experts. The first is Diana Seaver Greenwald, an art and economic historian. She's a specialist in 19th century American and French art and the William and Leah Pourvu curator of the collection at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. It's in her capacity as curator of the Gardner's current exhibition, Manet, A Modern Family, that Diana is going to kick off this event by talking us through the exhibition, which I think I'm right, Diana, is the sixth that you've organized at the Gardner. Prior to taking up her post, Diana was Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. In this year of so many major Impressionist exhibitions across the world, I'm especially looking forward to hearing Diana's perspective on how we might understand this show in relation to this wider context and in relation to new directions in 19th century art histories. What sorts of narratives are made possible in a smaller, more intimate show, how this research expands our understanding of Monet's work, his network, and the lives of individuals who've not typically been part of the art historical story. Diana also edited the important exhibition catalog for A Modern Family with, I believe, Diana, 11 contributors. Excellent, thank you. And her publication record also includes several other catalogs and two monographs. So after this introduction to Manet, A Model Family, we'll hear a response and questions from Susan Waller, who currently teaches at the University of Southern Maine, is Professor Emerita of Art History at the University of Missouri-St. Louis, and an independent scholar and art historian whose research focuses on the social history of artists and models in the 19th and early 20th centuries. We are so fortunate to have Susan with us because her research, namely the book The Invention of the Model, Artists and Models in Paris, 1830 to 1870, published by Ashgate in 2006, largely opened this field, which interrogates what Susan calls the artist model transaction. She continues to publish in this area, among others, in edited volumes, as well as the Oxford Art Journal, the Art Bulletin, and Art History. And I want to highlight in this context her fascinating 2022 article for 19th century art worldwide, which reconstructs the history of the North African model known in later 19th century Paris as Salem, le Prince de Tombouctou. Susan will therefore be able to give us some perspective about the state of research into artist models over the past 20 years, what work is left to be done, what new and exciting directions might be. As Susan's work continues to teach us, there is an ethics to excavating the biographies and lived experiences of models, which have so often been obscured or considered unimportant. Other recent exhibitions have taken up this imperative, and of course, I'm thinking of the landmark Black Models exhibition, as well as more recently, the London National Gallery's small Discovering Degas and Miss Lala, with its stunning revelations about the professional as well as the familial life of the famed acrobat. The research behind these sorts of exhibitions helps us to move beyond the very 19th century emphasis on models as gendered, racialized, and classed types, to centering their lived experiences and working conditions, however difficult it might be in many circumstances to find adequate archival records. And that's a running theme of Susan's publications about paid models. I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about the practicalities of doing research and finding documentation about artists' relationships with unpaid models, what traces remain about those transactions. And in the context of a wider interest in 19th century studies in artists' social networks and how these impacted upon their production, something we'll hear much more about in Harman Siegel's talk in the new year, Manet, A Model Family raises questions about what we can learn about artists from looking at how they work with their families. After Diana and Susan's conversation, we will open the floor to audience questions. If you could please put those in the Q&A tab, I and my co-organizers will keep track of them. We expect the event to run about an hour and a quarter, but we will stop definitively after an hour and a half. So thank you very much for being here. You're very welcome. Thank you to Susan and Diana. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Diana for a presentation about the exhibition.
Thank you so much. It's a real thrill to be here. And now we're going to do the awkward screen share, but hopefully now you're just seeing the back end of you're just seeing my slides and not the back end. Can you give me a thumbs up, Allison? Yes, awesome. This is clearly I've obviously presented notes by accident at one point. So I'm just going to kick us off with a very brief introduction to the show. So we're all on a little bit of the same footing for the discussion. And then I'll hand it off to Susan. So Manet, A Model Family, currently on view at the Gardner until January 20th, really started with this view, which you're looking at here, which is our portrait of Manet's mother, Madame Auguste Manet, or Eugénie Désirée Fournier Manet, which is in the Gardner Museum's Blue Room. And I'm kind of hoping that many of you have been to the Gardner before, but even this one brief shot can show you that the Gardner is not installed like a typical museum. We're governed by a will that makes it so that we can't change these installations in our historic building. And so something we've tried to do with our exhibition program as it's grown over the past 5-6 years is to really find works that maybe are a bit overlooked in their permanent collection spaces like this one has been, and really build shows around them. And so I think one of the first things about the practicalities of building a show is what's in your collection. And this absolutely gorgeous painting, which was conserved actually for this exhibition, is really the beginning of the kernel of the idea to talk about Édouard Manet's family and how they influenced his artistic practice. I'm going to take you through very briefly. There is the cast of characters in this. The Manet family, which many of you, because I'm speaking to an expert audience, probably know is reasonably complicated, but we'll do a very brief kind of overview. Imagine you're stepping into our galleries. Allison mentioned, we have quite a small gallery at the Gardner. So we're about 1,800 square feet across two spaces. And that means that this is a smaller checklist, certainly than something like a Manet Degas or that you see at larger institutions, but it's nonetheless 42 works. But we work within a kind of a much smaller space. So in this first gallery, we introduce our cast of characters. Again, this will be news to no one here, but among those characters are, of course, Édouard Manet himself. We have this gorgeous image of him at right, which is actually on loan to us from RISD. And then there are his parents. As you know, Manet is from is from an haute bourgeoisie background. His father was a Ministry of Justice official and a judge. You see this early double portrait that he created of his parents, one of his first submissions to the Salon, where Auguste Manet left is wearing, of course, the red thread of the Légion d'honneur. And it is sort of into this context of an haute bourgeois Parisian family that or really one could say our primary characters, and yes, I'm jumping around with dates of paintings, but it's more fun to look at paintings than carte de visite, enter. And of course, I'm talking about Suzanne Leonhoff, who we see here, who comes to work for the Manet family as a piano teacher, probably to teach Édouard's two younger brothers the piano while he was on a ship to Brazil in an ultimately failed attempt to join the French Navy. We also know that about 3 years into that employ in 1852, she gives birth to a son, Leon Leonhoff, or often called Leon Leonhoff. Of course, we know the name on his birth certificate is Coella. I will get to that. And this is kind of this moment where the Manet family or Édouard's personal life gets a little bit complicated, potentially. Léon is born in 1852. Édouard, of course, would later marry Suzanne in 1863 after his father's own death in 1862. And there are lots of questions that kind of swirl around this. The main ones of which, of course, are around Léon's paternity. I won't go through the whole kind of pros and cons of different let's say, situations or possible paternity outcomes in this. I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. But basically, we know that Léon is Suzanne's son, of course, in public for the majority of her life. She refers to him as her youngest brother. And there are basically three candidates for who is Léon's father who've been proposed, possibly a wandering musician with the last name Coella, which is the name that appears on his birth certificate, possibly Édouard himself. Has to do with the fact that Léon's second name is Édouard, as you can see here, that he's his godfather. And then the third option, which I think, Nancy Locke has proposed, and Nancy is really the expert on this and a contributor to the catalog, of course, is Auguste Manet, which would make Léon both Édouard's stepson and half-brother, which does create some discomfort sometimes, and I think is part of the reason, and we can go into this in the Q&A, that these two in particular have been a little bit neglected when we talk about Édouard and his practice. But what I really want to emphasize here is how often he depicted his family. So some of these are estimates, and some of these are kind of a guess about when it's Suzanne based on it being kind of a woman of her profile in gray. But Manet paints his family constantly. And Suzanne and Léon are his two most frequent models in oil, really by far, which I think surprises people who often think about Victorine Meurent or they're aware of the Bert Morisot images. And so the second kind of scholarly impetus for this show, beyond highlighting the Gardner's painting, of course, is to tell this story of these people who are absolutely critical in the visual record of Manet's work, but again, I think had been pushed a little bit to the side. Okay, I will briefly take you through the show. We have this sort of act structure, the first one being Act 1, Old Master's New Family. That's partly to force some linearity in the cube of our gallery. But imagine you're walking through, and this is really where we show Édouard's early work, or Manet's early work, where he's really engaging with old master sources in really fascinating ways. And I think this is critical. Even before his marriage to Suzanne, Suzanne and Leon are at the center of these various experiments to try and cast modern day Parisians, in this case, like I said, Suzanne and Leon, in what feel like old master scenes, or almost like pick and choose old master scenes where he's grasping on any number of sources. So for example, many of you are probably familiar with Surprise Nymph, which sadly doesn't really leave Buenos Aires. I can talk about that in the Q&A. But we were able to get a study for it, which is in the collection in Norway, the National Collection. And this is a painting that's engaging with sources from Rembrandt and Rubens, other images of Susanna, kind of a really interesting clin d'oeil to Suzanne's own name. And so there are any number of drawings and prints. We also have several in the show where we see Suzanne posing nude. This is pre-marriage, in what feels like a very ambitious attempt to create something probably quite large for the salon. As many of you may know, the Surprise Nymph, it's probably a fragment. It's probably part of a painting that looked a little bit more like this and must have been massive. He ends up sending it for exhibition in St. Petersburg. And we also have Leon, who's really in the mix. One of the early images of him that's confirmed is from Lyon, and this is in the show, where we have Leon around age 7 in the corner here holding a tray. This is part of a Velázquez-like scene. And then Leon becomes this vehicle for Manet, not only to pose in these old master scenes, but also to experiment with media. I want to give a particular shout out to Katie Kremnitzer here, one of our catalog contributors who really is the expert on Manet across different media, but we see him isolating him in a watercolor. He works him in a series of prints. And this is a role that Leon will actually play sort of again and again in a fascinating way, as Manet is experimenting with works on paper in addition to playing with old master sources. Leon is probably his most flexible model. We have 2 images of him here in theory painted about a year apart. Of course, as we know, dating and with this artist can be problematic. Both of these are in the show side by side. And what I find really interesting is we were able to find the old master sources for them, or possible old master sources for them. And so look at Leon's youth at left, his sort of age at right, even though these are depictions done fairly close together, which might have something to do with boys in puberty, and I'm keenly aware of that. But we think that the source for the painting at left, for Leon blowing bubbles, is probably a Chardin. There was one of a series of soap bubble paintings that actually was on sale in Paris right around this time. And then the other, and this is new research by Alex Zivkovic, who's a graduate student at Columbia who wrote for the catalog, and this is in his wonderful catalog entry, is probably this Ribera of an old man. So you have this sense that Leon's face is almost pulled in the direction, and I'll just toggle back briefly, of the source that Manet is engaging with. And this is a theme we'll see again and again, where Leon really does seem to be cast in all sorts of scenes, and is willing or able or whatnot to be as flexible as Manet needs him to be. The end of this first section is Fishing, the masterful painting from the Met, which is a very enigmatic piece. It references Rubens, it references Carracci, the landscape setting. The original title of this painting was actually Saint-Ouen. The title Fishing is kind of has complicated sources. The landscape probably looks like Gennevilliers, so the sort of ancestral lands of the Manet family, which Édouard here at right, with Suzanne as his Helena Foumont, had recently inherited from his father who passed away, or a portion of which he had recently inherited. And we have Leon at the far left on this shadowy bank. This painting is really interesting, I think, for this discussion today, because it represents a pivot point for Suzanne. Previously, as I showed you in the Surprise Nymph pieces, she's a nude model. She's not named. That all changes after her marriage to Édouard in 63, and this is considered kind of a marriage gift or a marriage portrait, celebrating that, or done just before that marriage. And never again will she be a nude model. She makes this transition to being the bourgeois wife, which brings us to Act Two, Three Manet Women. And this is really where we dug into the portraits that Manet creates of the three women who are Madame Manet in his life, all three of whom he cared for deeply. The first is, of course, our painting of his mother, Eugenie. And I want to say a brief thing here about, his family is supporting him both as unpaid models, but also financially. He is well off. His mother in particular was particularly wealthy. Again, Nancy Locke has done some really interesting research about this and kind of the rules around the estate and the division of wealth with her husband. And she would continue to bankroll Édouard's career and sort of existence for his entire life. She helps fund his solo exhibition in 1867. Édouard and Suzanne, and for a period, Léon as well, live with Eugenie. And she remains the primary hostess in the family. But I often say it's easier to be an avant-garde artist if your family is paying the bills. And she certainly was, in addition to being the parent among his two parents, who was sort of more supportive of his artistic ambitions. This absolutely gorgeous painting, of course, which shows Suzanne plying her art at the piano and has its own complicated history that we can talk about in the Q&A. But this is the type of depiction of Suzanne that starts happening, right? She is at home. She is in the paneled home of the Manet family. She is the wife. She is no longer the nude model. And it's really interesting to think about the transition. And our third Madame Manet, of course, is Berthe Morisot. There are there are going to be forthcoming projects about Morisot and Manet, which will be wonderful. But I think there are a couple of really interesting things about this image of Morisot, which we borrowed from Cleveland. One of which is, while it is unfinished, there is sort of an inherent sketchiness to it, which the painter Bill Scott, who is also a Morisot scholar and who contributed to the catalog, highlighted. Feels a little bit like a tribute to Morisot and her own sketchy style that she's starting to develop around the time of this painting, kind of an effort to look effortless. She remarks that Manet could make something look effortless, but he'd actually repainted it about 25 times and scraped down. So there's something that feels a bit like a painted contribution, or I should say homage to the subject as a painter and not just as an artist. But this is also probably one of the later depictions of Berthe before she marries Manet's younger brother, Eugène, of course, and herself becomes a Madame Manet, and the depictions stop, which has its own fascinating history. I am aware of time, so I'm speeding up. I promised I could do this whole show in 18 minutes, so we'll get it done. Act 3 is Absence Makes the Heart Grow Fonder. So as many of you know, Manet stays behind in Paris during the siege of Paris and the Franco-Prussian War, and he sends Suzanne and Léon and his mother to the southwest of France for safekeeping. I think this is a really critical moment. We can talk about it in the Q&A. I think some of the dismissal of Suzanne's role in Édouard's career has to do with this sense that it wasn't a love match, that that their marriage was not romantic, or anyway, we can get into it. But there's this moment where they're separated for the first time, in probably almost 2 decades. And Édouard just sends this stream of beautiful letters about how much he misses her, about how he's worried about her, about what's happening in Paris and how horrible the conditions are. And so we actually have this moment where the archival record captures that this is a really caring relationship filled with quite a lot of love. And I think that really inflects how I came to think about the project and how important his family was to him. This has its echoes in the painted record. So we have Interior at Arcachon on loan from the Clark, done when he's reunited with his family, and he travels to the Southwest to see them. And then Reading, which I know we started with, which actually begun its life as a solo painting of Suzanne, almost, and Léon at right is actually added later in the 1870s. There's almost this revision of the family group, which is quite fascinating. Although, as Emily Beanie has pointed out, this also collapses the age difference between them to paint them at different times. So it makes them more look like possibly the sister and brother they purported to be. So the last part of the show we call Act 4, Keeping the Manet Legacy. And I know Susan has questions about this, but we really wanted to carry the show sort of beyond Manet's death for a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, let's just there's this amazing painting of Manet's cousin, Jules de Joilly, who's also the family lawyer, which honestly, it's even better not in reproduction. It's on loan to us from the National Museum of Wales, and it's never been to the US before. It only recently resurfaced. I can talk about that in a bit. I've left a quote from Manet's own will here, because all the ways that the family seems to work and function while the artist is alive kind of falls apart when he dies. He does his best to try and have Suzanne and Léon inherit his portion of the Manet estate. His mother, who outlives him, doesn't respect this wish. She actually asks Suzanne to be reimbursed because she says that they don't have a legitimate heir. And so it creates this situation, and this is kind of the last install shot, where Suzanne and Léon, their only inheritance is basically artworks, and they start selling them. And Manet, it's not particularly financially remunerative at first. And you end up with situations where there's maybe some mucking about with paintings, some retouching, some sprucing for sale, some cutting of sketchbooks. And then, of course, this, which I was really excited to get, is actually a copy that Suzanne commissioned of an original that's now in Norway when she was forced to sell a portrait of hers that she loved. And she creates this copy to live with. And then after her own death, Léon sells it. And I think it's this management of the estate after Manet dies and the take that they've mismanaged his artistic estate that's also created some bias against them when we really consider the role of particularly Suzanne and Léon in Manet's life. And with that, I will leave it there and hand it over to Susan.
Nope. Thank you. Let me see if I can find my slides. Can you all hear me? Wait a moment here.
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay, so first of all, I really want to thank Allison and Alexis and Samuel and Claire for inviting me to participate in this event and to engage with Diana's fascinating show. I had a chance to see it over the weekend, and it really is worth visiting if you're in the Boston area. And I especially appreciate it because I find Manet's choice of models over the course of his career particularly fascinating from the perspective of the pose as a social practice, a practice which is really central to 19th century artistic production. And to my mind, he really seems to be a pivotal figure in what is an evolving practice, particularly as artistic production shifts from historical compositions to representations of contemporary life. Excuse me. And I've often, as I work on models, one of the things that sort of has emerged for me is that although Impressionism, we know the story of Impressionists as moving from inside the studio out into the streets and parks and working in plein air, despite a lot of curiosity about individual models, and we might think of Victorine Laurent or Berthe Morisot, or more recently, Laure, the African Caribbean model who appears in Olympia. there really has not been, I don't think, a lot of attention to the evolution and the changes in studio practice that engage the model and the pose. And I think that Manet is really central to that kind of that evolution. What I want to do today is just take a little time to actually look at some of his early studio practice, really as kind of a prelude to what Diana has presented. And then we can kind of talk about the shifts that appear in terms of the work that's in the exhibition. To start with, Manet's initial engagement with the model was really in the teaching studio of Thomas Couture. And there he would have been trained and schooled in the traditional practice that had become really established in the École des Beaux-Arts. I'm showing you on the left a painting of Couture's teaching studio. And as in the École, models pose nude this is probably familiar to all of you, pose nude for a week at a time under the direction of the massier. And the students produced academies, painted, drawn. I'm interested in the fact that we really don't seem to have any from Manet during this period. And if anybody knows of them, I'd be very interested. Couture's approach really to posing the model was very traditional. He advocated posing models in attitudes that replicated works by former masters. He wrote, "You can find in nature types very similar to the antique. Take these models and pose them like the figures that they suggest, make a conscientious study of them, and then compare it with the antique, marking the difference." So this would have been really the technique, the approach that Manet would have been schooled in. Interestingly, according to Proust's memoirs, Manet was rather impatient with this approach. He did not, he complained quite strenuously about the stilted the stilted attitudes of the professional models. And this, of course, gave rise to that famous quotation where he says to Dubosc, who is actually the model that you see on the right in a painting from the École des Beaux-Arts, Dubosc being really, in the 1850s, the doyen of professional models working in Paris. And Manet, very unhappy with his pose. Dubosc says, "Well, I've posed for many students who have gone to Rome." And this is when Manet says, "Well, yes, but I'm in Paris and that's where I want to stay." Now, according to Théodore Duché's biography of Manet, when Manet left Couture's studio to establish his own independent studio, he, having been fed up with this practice, deliberately rejected Impressionist models. Duché writes, his models would no longer be professional, special personages. He would choose them from among the men and women of varied appearances that the multiplicity of human types can offer. But it's interesting that really when one reviews Manet's approach, particularly in the early years after he establishes his studio, he does continue to work from models drawn from the professional community of Paris. And so we find works like the one on the left, L'Italienne. We don't know the name of this particular model. It's been suggested that it's Agostino Segatori, but to my mind, that's extremely unlikely, for reasons we can get into if people are interested. And on the right, you can see a popular image from the press a little bit later showing the population of Italian models in Paris. And clearly, the woman who posed for Manet, whoever she was part of this community of professional models. We can also look to some of the works that he produced slightly later, like this one that was posed for by Auguste Lagren, who came from a family of Roma, of quote unquote gypsies, who worked as models. His father, uncle, senior member of the clan, posed for the Old Musician, the painting that's now in Washington, D.C., and Auguste Lagren posed for the figure that you see on the left here from the Gypsies, which later was cut up. And we know from records at the École that both of these men posed for at the École des Beaux-Arts. So Manet's approach here is slightly different from the École. He's not posing them nude. He's dressing them in some of the Spanish costumes that he collected in his studio, but that was a very standard studio practice. Probably, of course, the most well-known of the professional models that Manet worked with during this period is Victorine Meurent, who is seen in a whole series of paintings. I'm showing you here, of course, Mademoiselle V in the costume of an espada, again, dressed in these Spanish costumes, a painting which was based on her pose in the painting, her attitude was based on the image that's been suggested that you see on the right from a engraving by Raphael, working again in that mode that Couture suggested. But it's also interesting, and we're thinking about, I know that I would suggest that Mouron's pose in this painting is a fairly strenuous pose. The idea of lifting one's hands that high and maintaining a pose was something that was quite strenuous, quite difficult. Professional models routinely relied on either ropes suspended from the ceiling or the kind of support that you can see on the right. And I think probably Victorine, looking at her left hand, probably would have relied on something like that. Now, it's about at this point that Manet begins to turn away from professional models, and we can see, of course, in the La Nymphe Surprise that Diana showed us, the painting posed by Suzanne Leinhoff, and of course in Déjeuner sur l'herbe, we also have two figures that were posed for by Manet's brothers. So we have here this sort of the beginning of a shift in his practice away. This is where he begins to shift away from the professional models to members of his family. And this undoubtedly had an impact on the studio practice and his relationship with the models, which I think is worth exploring further. So I will stop my sharing there and return it, I guess, to Allison.
Thank you so much, Susan. What fascinating background. Really, really appreciate that. So what I'd like to do now is move into the conversation between Susan and Diana. And as Alexis has just put in the chat, soon we're going to be opening that conversation up to the audience. So please use this Q&A function to give us your questions. We will collate them and then I will come to them in time. So thank you all, and over to the two of you.
Thank you. Shall I start, or how do we want to do
Yes,
this?
that would be great.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So Allison, Diana, one of the things that I find very interesting in the exhibition, you know the number of times that Manet represented Suzanne and used her as a model. It's interesting that different art historians have come up with different figures, but yeah. And I guess, but clearly she was an important model, just as Victorine and Berthe Morisot were. Those two figures are women who have received a great deal of attention in the scholarly literature. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about why Suzanne seems to have been, in comparison, so relatively overlooked.
It's a great question, Susan, and thank you. I think there are, and yeah, the different numbers are interesting. There in the catalog, we have a table of all the possible depictions of people, and that's the biggest number. There are a bunch of asterisks where some of it is like my guess, in conversation with other scholars, but sometimes it's based on a woman in a gray dress, because we know that Suzanne is often in gray. So if we cast a wide net, but yeah, it's always interesting. It's almost like a scavenger hunt to find who people are. I think there are a couple of reasons that Suzanne has been pushed a little bit to the side. First of all, I love that you put Surprise Nymph next to Déjeuner sur l'herbe, because I always ask myself if there's not a little bit of Suzanne in the déjeuner and kind of Victorine's body type. And we know that the other models in that are also family members of the main group, right? So it's kind of a combo of Gustave and Eugène, Manet's brothers. And then it's Ferdinand Leonhoff. It's actually Suzanne's brother, who's one of the other models. So I think but the first thing is that she's relatively rare in these kind of large, or almost completely rare in these large salon paintings, right? So, you have her in Surprise Nymph early in her life, and, she makes an appearance in, Music in the Tuileries, but a lot of images of her are of smaller scale. They're some of them, like Fishing, for example, is a family image, and it stays in the family after Manet's death. And some of these family pictures make appearances in 1867 in his own solo show. But there's something not quite as public for consumption about the depiction of Suzanne, particularly after their marriage, right? And so I think that's one piece of it. I think a really large piece of the neglect actually has to do with some of the bias against her that manifests itself even during her lifetime. She's Dutch, so she's not French. She comes to the family as an employee, although she's from quite an artistic family, and she's quite possibly discovered by Liszt as a piano player. She makes an attempt to study at the Conservatoire in Paris. But there is absolutely a condescension to her that shows up in the primary sources, quite frankly, in the Morisot's writing to each other, where they say, particularly Cornélie, the mother, says some particularly awful things that about her weight, about her appearance, about her accent. So there, from the earliest days, there's a bit of a bias towards her, and there's a sense that Manet doesn't even talk about her before they get married. There's this famous letter to Baudelaire, or there's a letter from Baudelaire to, I always forget if it's not Estruc, it's another friend. I should know this off. No, it's Carvel. It's the photographer, where Baudelaire says, I've heard the most incredible thing. Like, Manet is marrying this woman who's apparently like very beautiful and a talented pianist. How monstrous that a woman should possess so many qualities. But he and Baudelaire are friends at the time, and he's shocked that his friend is about to get married. So there's this kind of, even within her own life, that we get from the primary sources, like a cleaving of her from his more public, maybe his more public life, from his artistic life, even though she's present. The composer, Manuel Chabrier, even dedicates a piece to her. She's performing at the Thursday night gatherings at Eugenie's home, at their shared family home. But so I think it starts as early as her own lifetime that people are sort of dismissive of her. And then the last piece as to why she gets a little bit edited out is, I think, the handling of Manet's works after his death. She's actually quite impoverished after Manet dies. She's she's kicked out of her home that she shared with Eugenie. Basically, kicked out's a little strong, but anyway, she ends up living for free in like a small cottage that Jules de Joilly provides for her in Gennevilliers. She doesn't have a lot of resource. We have her little notebook in the exhibition that tracks her expenses. And she definitely oversees some retouching of canvases probably before they're sold. Julie Manet writes about this in her diary. Edgar Degas is furious about the cutting up of, the assassination of Maximilian. And, he has this whole méfiez-vous de la famille quote. So I think that also Emily Beattie wrote a beautiful essay for the catalog, and she puts it as, I think here starts the tale of a woman incapable of managing like her own, her inheritance of her own image or something. And so I think these forces have combined to push her a little bit to the side.
That's interesting. Yeah. I want to come back to that whole question of the
Yeah.
sort of end of her life. But the other thing that I have often thought, looking at the Surprise Nymphs, I've always been fascinated that in 1861, he exhibits in Russia.
Yeah.
But he doesn't, as far as I know, make any effort at that point to exhibit it in Paris.
Not that I'm aware of, but yeah.
And then in 1867, it does get exhibited in Paris. And I've always been sort of fascinated about that discrepancy. And I wondered, is this some kind of, because to exhibit it, for her to be exhibited nude in Paris, if she were recognized, would have just been, just impossible. And I'm wondering if you think that there was a kind of effort there to sort of respect her privacy, and Russia, who would have recognized her?
Right.
But then in 1867, would she have looked that different 7 years? I don't know. I've been very fascinated by the exhibition history, which seems to me tied up in the fact that she and other models, and I think also some of the Berthe Morisot paintings as well, that issues of propriety and privacy and putting women's faces out in public in the salon. I wondered if that's something that you had
thought about. That's such an
about.
interesting question. We had all this talk about the surprise nymph, and I'll say the reason the surprise nymph can't come to Boston is the Argentinians won't lend it for fear of actually seizure for sovereign debt. It's like a very particular seizure case there because it's national property anyway. It's like it was the weirdest loan, and the curator was very nice, but it was a very interesting loan denial. When I had always thought that the reason he doesn't show Surprise Nymph in 61 in Paris is partly because, you have this recollection from Proust in like the 1897 kind of version of recollections of Proust that are serialized, where he basically says that Manet is attempting to do a Moses saved. And if you looked at the study tombstone, there's that study has been titled both Study for Moses Saved and Surprise Nymph, where the Surprise Nymph figure is just a portion of this like larger, clearly very ambitious canvas that would have been the size of the old musicians, that he doesn't feel is successful. And so Proust basically, we get from Proust that he's not happy with it. And then, we happen to know that just Surprise Nymph shows up, which is a portion of what looks like this broader planned composition. So I had always figured that part of the reason for him sending it to Russia was that he just wasn't happy with it, because it wasn't this big monumental horizontal painting that he's interested in, that he had hoped to do. And there's a sense that maybe that was almost a first draft for the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which of course he does try to get into the salon. But it's a really good point about her being recognized. I hadn't thought about that. Although in 67, her face has not changed that much. And you wonder at what point, if when he's like retrospectively thinking in 67, that the Surprise Nymph feels more important to him in his development rather than just a failure, because he's kind of moved on, or I should say a fragment of a canvas that wasn't ultimately successful. But that's really thought-provoking, because the question of anonymity in the salon is something I've always loved. The portrait of his parents, of course, is exhibited as Monsieur and Madame M ... And so there's this pretension to anonymity in the titles, which of course doesn't exist to the people who know them. So you're right. Suzanne would have been immediately recognizable in 67. Susan, we should have had you contribute to the catalog on this.
Well, this is just speculative. Who knows? The other thing I wondered about, because in looking at, and I can't remember, at some point it suggested that of the paintings that Manet does of Suzanne, many of them are not finished.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly, looking at the show, it seemed like there was a good proportion of unfinished images of her. And I wondered what you thought was going on there. Was he unhappy with them and or was she just too impatient to sit for his notoriously long sessions? I mean, it sparked my curiosity. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's a good question too. I think, so I'm gonna provide a little context that comes from Isolde Pudemacher's essay, which is about really this. And if anyone saw Manet Degas or is familiar, there's the portrait of Suzanne at the piano, right? That really wonderful image. is partially, or if not entirely, a response to a portrait that Degas does of Édouard and Suzanne, where she's playing the piano, she's in profile, that gets slashed. It creates a huge break in their friendship, frenemyship, whatever their relationship was with one another. And Isolde talks a lot about this issue of the fact that Degas had the audacity to depict, that possibly it's around the audacity that Degas has to depict Manet's wife, and that it's sort of too intimate and too close. And, the reason I evoke that, although the whole surprise nymph being shown in 67 does wrinkle things a little bit, is a lot of the images of Suzanne post-marriage, right, feel very clearly made for domestic consumption. And so I think there's less pressure to finish, quite frankly. If it is him, first of all, she's readily available. I don't know if it's a lack of patience on her type, but he doesn't have to do much scheduling to make his wife kind of come in and sit. I don't know that he always has a show in mind for them, again, because I think there are these questions around what's the venue for images of her, with a couple of exceptions. And so I think that's part of it. And I also think he was slow. I mean, we know he was slow, right? And so I don't know if it's kind of a lack of urgency in his priorities or elsewhere around this. But it's true, there is a sketchiness to a lot of them. Even the paintings, I would say, that feel more finished. So even take something like Fishing, which feels very considered and is very bright. There's some really interesting kind of what feel like unfinished details. There's like an edge that's not varnished, which says that it was restretched at some point. And so that's my main inkling, is around like what's the ultimate outlet for these pieces, and it's not so clear, so he doesn't necessarily finish.
Right. I mean, I thought the other interesting thing that you point out in the exhibition is how with Berthe Morisot, there's a shift after she's married as well. And is it the sort of issue of propriety for a married woman to be, although there are, I think there are other paintings that Manet does of other married women, but they may not
the Guillemet, he paints that couple.
Yeah.
No, that's another really, I mean, it depends if you, I remember talking about this show with a colleague, like years ago at this point, and she was like, oh, but like Édouard and Berthe were like totally in love, right? And I was like, well, I don't know, I mean, like, and you're like, don't want to, I mean, it was a joke, but I think there's probably an issue of propriety there too, around continuing to paint her. I mean, and that's my main inkling, because it is very kind of sudden. I think that is mainly it. There is just this really interesting, with Berthe, there's this really interesting tension about, they're also really close colleagues, right? And I think they challenge one another artistically. And how is that recorded in a moment? How does that change when she becomes the sister-in-law, if at all? Like, do they continue to think of one another as colleagues once they're family? I think let me put it this way. What's really interesting about also the kind of cleavage with Berthe there is also marrying Eugène. Marriage, of course, as we know from her sister Edma, was a huge threat to a woman artist, and Edma stops painting, even though they trained together once Edma gets married. In marrying Eugène, Berthe actually marries someone who really advocates for her and supports her. He takes her pictures to the framers. He tells her not to get distracted and to like lock people out when she's supposed to be painting. He actually has kind of cut his teeth in supporting his own brother. He's his travel partner early in life. And poor Eugène, he never really finds a career. He paints, he writes, but he never kind of like gets it together. And so I also wonder how much, in the wake of marriage, and a marriage that's actually supportive of her professional art, you wonder how much her spending time modeling for Édouard, which again, as you've evoked, Susan, is incredibly time consuming, is furthering her goal as a professional artist. right?
Mhm.
Or not. And I actually suspect not just for maybe kind of like proprietary sort of sexist reasons from her husband, Eugène wouldn't have thought it was a particularly good use of her time because he really wants her to be painting.
Mm. That's an interesting point. Yeah, yeah. Ooh, so what other questions? Actually, I didn't have any other questions. More that kind of really we've talked a lot about Suzanne.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Leon as well, um, because I find it really fascinating that he, of all of the family members, I think that I can say this, continues to pose, but continues to pose in the sort of guise of other people,
Yeah.
performing in other people, and that, Manet continues to sort of shape those images based on earlier precedents to a degree that he doesn't so much with, say, Suzanne or even Berthe Morisot. Um, and I just wondered what what that to you indicated about their relationship, or why you thought that practice um, of working and that way of working with a model persisted, particularly in the case of Leon.
Yeah, Leon is the kind of enigmatic figure at the center of all of this. And if you come to the show, we actually, when you step out of kind of the little gallery first and you have your first sight line and it leads to fishing, we put a quote from Leon that he gives to Tabaron when he's sort of working with him. And he says, I'm paraphrasing, but the three of us, the Suzanne and Edward spoiled me so much, and the three of us lived so happily. I had no reason to question my birth. It's a secret of which I never learned the last word, right? And so I think Leon is very much in the family circle. There's no question. He is there. He is Suzanne's son. He is living with them. There's some recollection that they're all living together even before the marriage, although it's a little fuzzy. And also the retrospective memory of a man, kind of 50 years later talking about this. But he never has an official role within the family. He's never legitimized. Right. So he's never recognized as during Manet's lifetime as even Suzanne's son. And he's certainly never recognized as their legitimate heir, even though it's something that would have been quite easy to do. And as scholars of Impressionism will know, there are plenty of other Impressionists who father children out of wedlock. They marry the mothers and they recognize the children. Um, and so there is this odd mirroring in his continued work as a model. Um, who isn't named, who doesn't make this transition to kind of being like depicted as a member of the family, in mirroring that situation, his like legal situation, quite frankly.
Hmm.
He seems to have wanted to, he seems to have been very generous with his time. Leon gets a bad rap because of basically maybe selling some fakes in the 20s, which is not great. Like, I'm not going to excuse that. But he he's the one who really cares for Manet or helps care for Manet when he's very sick at the end of his life. He seems to have been fairly agreeable and around and wanting to please to be part of the Manet family. He writes this really crushing letter to Eugène. So Léon married late in life and his wife predeceased him. And he writes a letter to Eugène asking for permission for his wife to be buried in the Manet family plot, and basically evokes that, you've been close to your family my whole life, so on and so, and they say no, which is really quite crushing. So I think he basically is willing to please and wants to be in their orbit. And being a model is clearly part of that. And he seems to be pretty good at it if Manet continues to use him again and again. He also seems to have been fairly cheery, so putting up with the 20 sessions was also part of it. But no, he's fascinating. He's also the person who gets reproduced in prints the most often that are actually designed for public circulation. That's something that doesn't really happen to the rest of the family as much. And so there's this sense that he's not out of bounds for some of this public consumption in the way that some other family members might feel at
Yeah,
certain moments.
right. That's interesting. Interesting. The other thing that sort of related, I guess, that I noticed was or felt, and it sort of sent me back to look in terms of Manet's production overall, was the absence of his brothers, who
Yeah.
appear sort of early on in a couple of paintings and then kind of seem to disappear, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm overlooking some works, but I thought that I found that interesting. Not even, and in their case, I mean, initially they're posing, taking on roles of, you know, a Mayo or whatever one considers them in Déjeuner sur l'herbe, but no portraits of them either that seem, yeah, that I could find, which surprised me. Because I mean, Manet certainly does portraits of other men. Maybe I've overlooked them and they're there.
So there's certainly not of Gustav. There's there's On the Beach, which is from the back, which is Eugène and Suzanne together. That's in the Orsay. But it's true. They're also not particularly depicted. If anything, he goes to the Leonhofs. So there's a later scene that's in Belgium or northern France, and the name of which is going to, but anyway, it features one, I think it features Rudolf Leonhoff rather than Ferdinand. And that's like a later career piece. So yeah, no, it is interesting. His relationship with his brothers, by the way, I'll just say seems really funny from reading the letters. There's this hilarious letter he writes to his mother during the siege where he's like, I'm trying to find them jobs. It's basically is like the summary. Or I'm trying to prod Gustav, which you know is hard. But it's yeah, I don't quite know why maybe they won't put up with it. And he's got other people who he can draw on. But it is interesting. But yeah, Eugène gets a sort of portrait alongside Suzanne. That probably in the context of a beach vacation as a family. Interestingly.
Interesting. Yeah. So my last question comes back to that whole sort of last chapter of the exhibition, dealing with the sort of posthumous issues that surface once Manet dies and the family is, and Suzanne and Leon are kind of disinherited and the circulation of the paintings. I found it a very interesting decision to incorporate that into the exhibition because I think it raises issues that certainly within the academic literature are discussed, but I don't think I've encountered it before in a sort of an exhibition for the general public. So I was interested that was a decision that you made and wondered what your thinking was behind that, because it certainly does seem to raise some rather uncomfortable issues in terms of the tensions within the family.
Yeah. So I think the decision came from the fact that the story, in some ways it looks like everything is kind of hunky-dory while Manet is alive. He's, I often think that part of the reason he's so influential in art and art history is not only is he a great painter and, he does really innovative things, but he seems to have had quite a magnetic personality, and you shouldn't discount that and how that draws people in. And that seems to have worked within his family unit too, because like I said, they cohabit. There isn't this tension around money in such a clear way. So while he's alive, things between and Eugenie calls them Leonhoff world after his death, and the Manets seem to work, and that cracks within very quickly after he passes away. And so I think, first of all, to kind of be a little bit more truthful about the family story, you had to go beyond his death because his life actually masks some of the tension. The other reason we really wanted to draw it forward, and I pointed out, we actually have a painting that was probably commissioned by Suzanne to live with a copy after she's forced to keep selling paintings to survive. We wanted to include that copy because for a more general point, families are often charged with managing an artist's estate and reputation after they die. And you would think for someone as famous as Manet now that that wouldn't have been an issue of tension or concern or questions about authenticity, but it was. And it's a set of issues. And I should point out that that copy, you know, passes through the hands of Théodore Doré, like he owns it and sells it at one point. It's not just Léon kind of selling stuff. But the families have roles in artists' lives after they pass away and in their legacies. And so we really wanted to draw that out too. And we started this talking about why is Suzanne cut out of some of the discussions. And I think it is some of this behavior after he dies. And the allowing of retouching and Julie Manet criticizing her Dutch nonchalance around all of this. Of course, Julie has inherited everything and is wealthy at 16. So how much empathy she can really muster is a question. Barrett, on the other hand, I will say, did support Suzanne while she's alive financially with a small annuity. So that's kind of why we wanted to do it, even though it's a little bit academic. And not always so visual, but we did our best with archival material and then with that painting and then some comp images around Alone from the Met that probably was slightly retouched, which is not news to them, nor anyone who works on Manet, to draw that out.
Well, it's interesting because actually I have to say when I went through that final gallery, I have to wonder a little bit if your title wasn't a bit ironic, because the tensions, and are they really a model family? I also found myself wondering, thinking about the dynamics and the way, as you say, with Édouard's death, it sort of cracked. It made me wonder if, because Eugenie seems to be such a sort of strict personality and very austere, whether with the death of Auguste, that really made Édouard the man of the family, and whether some of the masking had to do with the fact that she, being a proper bourgeoise, would defer to him as long as he was alive because he was the senior male. And then with his passing, that she no longer had to.
I think that's an excellent point, actually. Yeah, that, you know, there is this sense that, yes, he's the man of the house now and that she has to defer. I think that I hadn't heard it phrased that clearly, but that's an excellent way to put it. And yeah, I think she was formidable. I think there's no question. You know, it's really interesting to see her behind her husband who's quite ill. And there's, you know, at one point she has to like write the letter asking for his permission to retire because he's suffering from the effects of late stage syphilis, which of course would also be Manet's cause of death. And she's sort of, her eyes are cast down to match his pose. And then in our painting at the Gardner, when she's sort of free, and freed is the wrong word, but when she's solo and she's still in her widow's wear, which she would wear for the rest of her life, you just get the sense that she was strong. She stares you straight down. He doesn't shy away from showing her age, from showing her intensity. Yeah, she was clearly quite the woman. Yeah. Which is what Gardner seems to have been drawn to, by the way. She liked images of powerful women. And that seems to be why Berenson targeted it for her.
Interesting. Well, I have to admit, juxtaposing the portrait of Madame Manet next to some of the portraits of Suzanne, I can see why Manet might have welcomed a life with Suzanne. She just,
yeah,
it just seems like something totally different from what he probably grew up with in terms of family dynamics.
Well, it's interesting. Bill Scott, when he came to the opening, one of the contributors to the catalog said something. I thought, he was like, you know, everyone's so shocked that he married Suzanne, you know, because she's foreign, she's not of his class necessarily. He was like, but he never did anything his family wanted him to do. Right. And yeah, I think she was a comfort. And from all accounts, she was a very kind, calming person. As we know, he's like all over the place. He's sensitive to criticism. He's like confident one minute and insecure the next. And I think she was grounding, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And the important, you know, the power that it is to be a grounding person.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for those questions, Susan, and for those really thoughtful answers. I wonder if I can just, that last question had started to push us toward thinking about method. Um, and I wanted to just invite you briefly, uh, Diana, um, to to think about method with us. And by nature, the show is a very biographically driven endeavor. But I don't sense it harkens a return to a biologically driven art history, or maybe in some ways it might that you find productive. I wondered if you could situate your approaches in relation to other work that's been done on feminist models, because so often it's been about social politics, about sexual politics. It's been, feminist in thrust, quite a lot of it. So I was just curious for your reflections there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It is very biographical, right? And I'll admit my bias is in my academic. I mean, my curatorial work is academic, but sort of my peer-reviewed kind of not museum-related work, very much about like social histories and the nuts and bolts of why artists do what they do, and what are these kind of like, I need to eat, I need to get on a train somewhere. How does that actually affect what they're painting? So I think I tend to that can lead you down a road to a more biographical path. I think a lot of the feminist literature about Manet really situates gender dynamics around gender and sexuality in a very public arena, right? So it really talks about this in terms of like audience reception, in terms of like, what does, Victorine Morel's like bare flesh really mean in this setting, and the various feminist theories that we can apply to that, or around gays or whatnot. And so what I was really interested in is almost a feminist reading in the more private sphere, in the
Yeah.
sense of like trying to recapture and recoup the importance of, I often say Suzanne's art is completely lost because she was a pianist before the age of recording. So we can't even really valorize her in a way as like a visual artist on Manet's part, and more so we are able to do that. And I think that's another reason she's able to be higher up. So I don't view them as mutually exclusive, that you have to do this and dismiss all sorts of theoretical readings, which are really helpful and generative. But for me, it's about recapturing almost the stories that you could apply a feminist reading to, because previously they're a little bit lost in the realm of the home.
Yeah.
I really admire Susan's work in this way, because Susan, I think you do that obviously for whole rosters of models, who are paid models, who are, it's that in between moment between when it shows up on canvas and when the artist is working on it that can be so generative.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So there's a feminist politics to zooming in on the domestic as the scene of production. Uh and yeah, that's fascinating. I'm curious, when I when I read the title of the exhibition, my mind constantly wants to make it a modern family.
Yeah.
Is that just me, or is there something, is there a play with modernity that you kind of would encourage? Or I've just seen so many of the exhibitions this year, and the focus on terms like modern life,
Yeah.
impressionism, so many of these, and we are talking about a Monet show. I mean, these are big words, so I'm just sort of curious about that from your curatorial perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question. And curators also work with marketing departments.
Yeah.
So like keep that in mind. So yeah, a model family. To be honest, Susan, you're right. It was intended to be sort of ironic. So when I first pitched this show, it had a question mark after model family because of all the kind of questions and tensions. And then also they are serving as models. So my question mark got nixed. And this title went through a couple of iterations. Yeah, a modern family came up. Part of it was actually, and again, this is the world of marketing departments. The words modern and Manet show up in lots and lots of other exhibitions.
Yeah.
And and books. And so model felt with that little kind of twist was more was basically approved by my marketing department, by Princeton University Press, which did the catalog. But no, it is, I think Nancy Locke wrote an absolutely beautiful series of contributions to this, a couple of catalog entries and an essay. And she talks about, and actually Hilton Als in his contribution as well, talks about the modernity of Eugenie and her image of her in mourning in black and this kind of strong older woman who's shown in kind of all of her age and life experience. And so I do think there is real modernity in this family in the way that it arranges itself and all the kind of things left said and unsaid. But yeah, this is life in a museum. I think there's some curators on the call who can probably also speak to that.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, they are very relatable families.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience, and don't be shy. We do have some time left over, so if you have any questions, please put them in there. We've got one here from Jim Rubin, who thanks you for a great presentation. And he's wondering, is there a decline in representations of Suzanne as Manet's career develops, possibly in favor of other more socially prominent women like mistresses and actresses?
She's depicted pretty consistently across his career. It's actually a really interesting question. I think it's just the level of kind of finish declines a little bit. And it feels maybe not destined for a market. What's really interesting is the painting of her on a bench in the greenhouse is a fairly late career work. It's gorgeous. We have the copy that was made by probably her nephew, but the original is in Norway. That same bench is used for in the conservatory. It's the same studio prop. It's probably the same kind of like roughly like plant life that he's thinking about. But the image of Suzanne is much less finished, and it's made probably for them to live with in their home, right? Not to be sold. But no, she's a pretty constant presence. I'd have to go and like actually graph the rough dates of the paintings, but I don't think it declines. It just changes in kind of shape.
Thank you. And we have another question from John Klein, who's asking you to clarify Monet's unfinished portraits of Suzanne, whether Manet felt less obligation to finish them if they weren't to be exhibited or to enter the marketplace.
I think that's probably right. And they're in the studio. I should say huge shout out to Leon Leonhoff as well for the he does this incredible inventory of the studio after Manet dies, where he takes photographs of everything that's in the studio, or he commissions Lochal to do it. But anyway, and then annotates it on these cards that are now bound together and are in both the BNF and the Morgan. Yeah, I think they're unfinished and they hang out around the studio. And I think you're right. He's not planning to sell them. It's not really so clear what he's going to do with them. Although I would argue, I know there's the sale to Durand Ruel and he values his work quite highly after that. I don't know how market-driven Manet really ever was, again, given the whole independently wealthy thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sorry for the dose of economic reality. And again, it helps if you're an avant-garde artist. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, the practicalities really, hugely matter here. And I loved your description of Act 3, where we get some of this documentation, some of these letters that attest to the personal relationship, because Susan, your work has been, models, records from the École des Beaux-Arts or, regulations and these kinds of public documents. And so how do you, when you're doing research into unpaid models, find the documentation, the archival things? On the one hand, you can see it being easier because you've got letters, you've got, wills, these kinds of things, testaments of friends. On the other, you don't have these kinds of public records. So a lot, when it's unregulated, can sort of pass. I mean, do you find, Susan, that because you've been doing work on artist models for a long time, do you find that there are more resources now than when you started this work?
Hmm.
It's
Um,
easier to search for things, it's easier to find things, or
I'm not sure about that. It's interesting, actually, the sort of private records, because that's one of the things that I've noticed is artists in their letters and their memoirs rarely mention their models.
Mm.
They're kind of, I don't know, like studio furniture, so they just don't rarely kind of are named. I mean, they may make lists in their studio, or there may be notes on drawings, but in terms of um, private records like letters, I've not found that to be um, a very good source. Of course, one of the dilemmas of working on models is that trying to find, there's no sort of single archive, and trying to go through all the
yeah.
different archives of different models just becomes kind of impossible. I sometimes have a fantasy of starting a database where one could kind of track
Yes.
the names and different references, and sort of, and people working in various archives could contribute so that we could build sort of more of a bigger picture. Um, it's interesting, actually, the one thing that does, there is a kind of um, increase, I guess one would say, towards the end of the 19th century. There's more curiosity about models. Some of it's in the popular press, some of it's a variety of different sources, but they become a topic that is more focused on during after, I don't know, 1880, 1890, and into the 20th century for a variety of reasons, I think. Yeah. So, and some of the sources are um, questionable, I guess one would say, but at the same time, some of them do provide an avenue in to material that you can then kind of scope out around it.
Thank you. I'm just going to get one last question in before we conclude, and that's from Claire Moran. And she's wondering, Diana, does the intimate space of the gardener help in terms of expressing these intimate relationships?
That's a great question. I think, yeah, absolutely. When you have 1,800 square feet, first of all, I think this is a show, there is like a large universe of checklist because they appear in a lot of paintings, but filling like 10,000 square feet with this would probably be a bit of a challenge. And so there's something really nice about this feeling like kind of like a dossier show. Um, and also something we wanted to do in terms, so the Gardner itself, of course, is a very intimate space in the permanent collection. And you have smaller galleries, they're very densely hung. It's, if you haven't been to the Gardner, please come. It's nothing you've kind of ever seen. It's unlike on other museums, I would say. What we were able to change, though, particularly with our painting, and what we tried to do is it has quite a low hang height. And that was actually so that people could feel face to face with the sitters. And so in a way, our ceiling is at 24, but the walls are only, the highest ones are only to 12 feet, and hanging them slightly lower. We wanted to feel like you were really getting to know the sitters a little bit, in addition to admiring the paintings. And I love a low hang height. I love, and good lighting. Our painting, our staff members, it was great when we did our flash meetings for our frontline staff. They had no idea how great our Manet was. They were like, this is here. I'd never seen it because it hadn't, it needs to be relit in the blue room. But yeah, I think gallery size and setting really does matter for what story you're going to try to tell, and how much real estate you have.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful to hear that they are that they're face height. I always notice. And I think there's a feminist politics to that too. I walk through these galleries and realize that they're just not hung for me. It's very hard to see some of the details. So I can imagine that is really powerful. So I want to thank Susan and Diana so much for your time, for just a fascinating conversation, for sharing this with us, Diana. I think a lot of people on this call are not in the United States. and including myself, you can tell by the darkness outside. So it's a pleasure that for some of us it will be a real challenge to see the show in person, to get to hear about it and get such a behind the scenes perspective. Thank you. And Susan, we are really privileged to have you here engaging with us about this show. And to the audience, thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you at our future events. And on behalf of myself, Alexis, Claire, and Samuel, thank you all so much, and we hope to see you next time.